Welcome everyone to A Girl and a Flamingo podcast. My name is Ren and I hope you have been having a fantastic week out there in the world. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite locations in all the United States, St. Augustine. St. Augustine one is known as America's oldest city, and the locals have a nickname for it, the ancient city. Now, St. Augustine was founded 450 years ago, and it is so rich in culture and history that, of course, there's going to be one or two ghost tales go down from generation to generation. Now, St. Augustine is located in Northeast Florida, which is about 2.5 hours from Orlando. St. Augustine is full of all of these stories that involve blood, pirates, battles, everything that you would find in an old pirate movie. Alright, are y'all ready? So let's get into today's episode. St. Augustine, Florida, as I stated previously, is over 450 years old and is located in Northeast Florida. Along with being known as America's oldest city, or the ancient city, it is also notoriously called the most haunted city in America. So let's go back and let's talk about the history of St. Augustine. St. Augustine was founded in 1565 by the Spanish Admiral Pedro Mendez de Aviles. Admiral Aviles was commissioned by King Philip II in 1565, and he issued an asiento to Aviles to give him the Alentado a la Florida. Pretty much he gave him privileges to exploit the lands and find a settlement so the Spanish fleet could have an area where they could store their treasure and defend it. Aviles found an area that he thought was perfect on August 28th of 1565. It was the feast day of St. Augustine of Hippo. He named this new colony after the patron saint of his hometown, and his hometown was Aviles. And that patron saint is known as San Agustin or Saint Augustine. Now, the only problem for the Spanish troops was this land was already occupied, and it was by a Native American tribe. The Native American tribe was given the option of either leaving the area or converting to Catholicism and becoming Spanish subject. They did not want any part of that. As is normal, they did not want to be a part of that. They wanted to stay in their own area and they wanted their own land, which is understandable. That was their land. They were there first. They were Native Americans. The Spanish had no business claiming that land as their own. We have the Satura tribe, a Native American tribe, was so angry at the Spanish forcing their way onto their land that they burned St. Augustine to the ground, forcing the settlement to relocate more inland. St. Augustine has been said to have moved several times before it was at its final settlement, which is kind of inland, past inland. But no one knows for sure. It could have been the second location. So after the Spanish conquistadors had settled, they went around and started claiming lands in La Florida as their own for their king. So several of these soldiers went around and it was the same song and story. Kicking out those Native Americans or forcing them into Catholicism and setting up several ports along the Atlantic strip of Florida. This was at the end of troubles for the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine. There were multiple invasions from 1568 to 1672 on St. Augustine from the Satura tribe, the Tacatura tribe, and the Timura tribe, as well as the French and English troops. Pirates And here is where legend of the pirates of St. Augustine began, is they attacked St. Augustine several times as well. Back to the English invading St. Augustine, the settlement of Roanoke, as everyone knows about the settlement of Roanoke and its mysterious vanishment one day when one of the leaders came back with supplies after a year of being gone from Roanoke and found his entire community had vanished. And it is infamous in lore, in history, in the supernatural of what happened to the Roanoke colony. Sir Drake blamed the Spanish for the disappearance of Roanoke, and as a result, Francis Drake decided that he was going to attack St. Augustine. And again, they burned several buildings to the ground, and the Spanish realized that they did not have any fort that could withstand attacks. They did have a fort, but it was flimsy, so they decided to build a more durable fort that could withstand all the European and Native American attacks. So this is where the Castillo de San Marcos entered. The Castillo de San Marcos is the oldest fort in the United States that is still standing. It was built between the years of 1672 and 1695, and it took a total of 25 years to build from start to finish. The Spanish used this fort for military purposes to defend from the different European navies that were known to attack St. Augustine's, as well as the Native Americans and pirates. Castillo de San Marcos went through several name changes because the Spanish had a very short rule after it was built, and the St. Augustine Castillo and St. Augustine went to the English, and the English ruled St. Augustine for a while, and then it went back to the Spanish, who ruled St. Augustine for a while, and then it was acquired by the United States government, and the Castillo de San Marcos was used as a military port until 1933, when it was deactivated and given to the state of Florida as a national park. This Castillo de San Marcos is known to be haunted because of all the blood on the walls and all of the wars it has seen, for it is 450-year period that it has. The said that ghosts are on the spirits, the entities are all stuck there because of all the tumultuous years of battles that caused the event that traps spirits. One battle in particular is said to have been the glue that keeps those wandering spirits from going and enjoying their afterlife. During the time after it was built, several military families lived at the fort and went about their business. Now, the fort had a church and different rooms for military admirals, generals, and people on patrol that could live there, and they could fit their families comfortably. So let's go to a story. Let's go to the first haunted story that involves a colonel's wife and her lover of a captain. So Dolores Martí was the wife of Colonel Garcia Martí. It is said that she still haunts the fort. I will get back to that. Let me go into the story of what happened to Dolores prior to her death. Every night, very late at night, she would sneak off to see her lover, Captain Manuel Abella. So this went on for several months until her husband caught a smell of his wife's perfume on the captain, and then after a couple days, both Dolores and Captain Abella disappeared. No one ever saw them again, and after a hunt of around 100 years later, when some cannonball accidentally ripped a hole in the basement, workers found two skeletons that are thought to be both Dolores Martí and of her lover, Captain Manuel Abella. It is said that when he found out, the colonel tied up both the captain and his wife and left them in the basement to rot. And that is where their skeletons were found Manuela is very unhappy with the way things turned out, and she still haunts Castillo de San Marcos every night looking for her lover, going up the stairs to go to their secret rendezvous point. Now, people who have visited the basement have reported that they have felt something touching them, a feeling of nausea, a feeling of dread, and just the regular cold spots. The Colonel has also been spotted looking out to sea. Now, no one is sure why he was looking out to sea. Is he upset about his wife's infidelity or just sad? Including the story, the unfortunate Colonel's wife and her lover, Castillo de San Marcos had a prison where prisoners were kept throughout these years. This included Spain, US, and England all kept their prisoners there in abhorrent conditions. Now, this, if you've ever been to the Castillo de San Marcos, it can get very, very hot, especially in that area. But every time that someone goes in there, it is colder than the entire building. You go into the other areas of the Castillo, you'll notice it's kind of hot, especially on a summer day. I myself have visited there and I noticed it was a bit colder in the little jail versus everywhere else in the Castillo. Window there, so there could be really good ventilation. What do you think? Do you think good ventilation or ghost? Now, the story of the Colonel and Manuela are the most famous hauntings that have been told throughout generation to generation of the Castillo de San Marcos. However, there have been reports of other ghosts that no one is sure of the identity. There have been people saying there are orbs at night. They get chills when they walk through the entire facility, feel something touching them, that there's an overwhelming feeling of sadness in some areas at the Castillo de San Marcos. Moving on to the Tolomato Cemetery. So the Tolomato Cemetery was the first Catholic cemetery in St. Augustine, and it dated back to the first Spanish period of 1565 to 1763. Now, before we go into the Tolomato Cemetery and everything spooky about it, I'm just gonna give you a little fact about the first Spanish period. Now, when we talk about the first Spanish period, we are talking about the first time the Spanish had control or governed the St. Augustine area prior to the English taking over. The second Spanish period refers to when they retook control and they had rule over it up to the point that it was given to the United States. Moving back, Tolomato Cemetery was founded on land that the Guale tribe resided on. The Guale tribe was converted, depending on the story, was converted to Christianity, Catholicism, and the church and the cemetery were put on their old tribal land. The last known burial of the Tolomato Cemetery was in 1892. The cemetery is around 1 acre, so it's a small cemetery, and there are about around 100 grave markers. There is speculation that there are over 1,000 burials within the Tolomato Cemetery gates. In 1821, the Tolomato was part of a troubled period in the St. Augustine area where the residents of St. Augustine were mistaken for the dead, and all the residents were afraid that if they got sick or fell asleep one night, they would wake up in a coffin the very next day. Prominent story about being buried alive happened in 1821. Colonels when a military soldier's wife got sick and it was thought that she passed on. Now her husband was very, very, very distraught over this. So he had all his family come down and kind of waited and had her funeral procession take place on the way to the cemetery. Was put in her finest burial clothing and displayed as she went down. Her husband had his eyes on her the entire time on the trip to the cemetery, and on their way there, they encountered a tree where the branch hit the supposed corpse in the eye, and the colonel swears that she flinched. He immediately stopped the caravan and took his wife home. She woke up fine after a couple of days. There is another story that says she was in a coffin when she was woke up and sat up straight during her own funeral, in fear up till the day she died of being buried alive, and she did die a couple of years later after the incident, and her soul wanders the Tolomato Cemetery with unfinished business. Whether or not she doesn't want to go to the afterlife because of her traumatic incident of almost being buried alive is up for discussion. Huguenot Cemetery, which is the first public cemetery known in St. Augustine. And unlike the Tolomato Cemetery, they were the first cemetery that buried Protestant Anglo-Americans. Many of you may be wondering, why couldn't they be buried in the Tolomato Cemetery? Well, the Tolomato Cemetery only buried Catholics, and Protestant Anglo-Americans did not have their own cemetery for when they passed on. The last known burial was in 1884, and the cemetery closed shortly after. Huguenot Cemetery is believed to be one of the most haunted cemeteries in the ancient. It is so haunted that its nickname is the Spirit Central. There are over 436 burials. Alright, so quick history lesson on the cemetery. Let's go straight into our ghostly residents. Our first there are ghost hunters and cries and EVPs in the middle of the night. Visitors to this cemetery have reported feeling chills and seeing children running and shadow figures walking around the cemetery. Now, two of the most famous residents are a young girl and Judge John was died of yellow fever. And just to go back, the Huguenot Cemetery was founded in the nick of time prior to the outbreak in St. Augustine of yellow fever. So going back, this young girl died of the yellow fever. Now she floats among the trees in the cemetery and she loves waving to the guests. If you ever want to see her or go say hi to her, she is she is active during the hours of 12 to 2 a.m. Our next famous resident is Judge John Stickney, who died in 1882. He left prior to his death. His wife died a couple of years back, and with his death, he left his children orphans. Now, later in these children's life, they were all residents of Washington, D.C., and wanted to move their dad to a cemetery in Washington, D.C., so they could be closer to him. They had to have his body exhumed in order to move it. On the day of the exhumation, the workers began digging and opened his casket and saw that he had gold teeth. Thinking that no one would notice when the body arrived in Washington, D.C., they decided to steal the gold teeth just to get a little extra for their effort, closed the casket, and sent it on his way. Now, the judge was not very happy about his gold teeth missing, and as a result, he haunts the cemetery both day and night and is seen walking around the graves and walking around the grounds looking for something or someone. There's also a report of his laughing or a man that looks like the judge. Our last stop for the day is gonna be the Spanish military hospital that is of course located in the ancient city of St. Augustine. Now, the Spanish military hospital was originally built during the British occupation of St. Augustine from 1763 to 1783, and the person that built it was a Scottish carpenter that went by the name William Watson, and he purchased and remodeled the building into a dwelling. When the Spanish took back St. Augustine, they decided to make this building into a military hospital for their military that got injured during attacks on the city. The hospital had three wings where they could treat the different patients throughout the years. In the 1800s, there was an issue with the water and they wanted to build a new water pipe that went underneath the Spanish military hospital. When the workers got underneath the hospital, they found several skeletons underneath the hospital. And as it turns out, that the hospital was built on the Timucuan tribal land. Timucuan tribe were the original settlers of St. Augustine who were forced out during the first Spanish occupation. This discovery, they still went ahead and built it and did not honor the ground, which they found out was a part of a Native American tribe. There was a lot of bad luck in that hospital because both wings burned to the ground during the 1800s. The hospital west wing burned down in 1818 and the remaining parts of the hospital stayed in operation until 2 years into when the United States acquired Florida, and then the hospital completely closed down in 1823. Hospital East Wing was destroyed in the fire of 1895. The only building remaining is the original Watson House. Now, because of its horrid history and lack of regard for the original Native American residents, the hospital is extremely haunted, and even prior to it becoming a hospital and having so many military men die inside, many workers reported an evil entity that felt like it followed them around the hospital. Today, employees and managers and guests have reported hearing cries and feeling overwhelmed and being terrified, seeing ghosts of military members, doctors, and staff. Most of the time there is a feeling of overwhelming since many of the patients that were brought in were need of critical care. And that wraps up this week's episode about St. Augustine. Now, like I said at the intro, I'm gonna have to break up the different hauntings of St. Augustine because there are so many stories, so much history that it cannot be covered in one episode. Now, I hope you join me next week when we talk about one of the most infamous hauntings in St. Augustine, and that is the St. Augustine Lighthouse that has been featured in several shows, including Ghost Adventures. Well, I will see you next week, and I hope you have a fantastic week out there.